Why does Donald Trump want China out of Jamaica? It sounds at first like an odd question. Jamaica is not a nuclear power. It doesn't sit on the UN Security Council. It has no aircraft carriers, no long-range missiles, no seat at the table when the world's biggest economies argue over trade and territory. And yet, in Washington briefing rooms, in State Department cables, and in the private conversations of people who study global power for a living, this small island of under 3 million people keeps coming up, again and again, as if it matters far more than its size suggests, because it does. Somewhere off the coast of Jamaica, container ships the length of 4 football fields glide past every single day, carrying everything from car parts to smartphones to the clothes on your back. Somewhere in the hills of St. Elizabeth Parish, a Chinese state-owned company controls one of the richest bauxite deposits on Earth, the raw material that becomes the aluminum in your car, your kitchen foil, and the fighter jets that patrol the skies above 2 rival superpowers. And somewhere in Kingston, a highway built with Chinese money, Chinese engineers, and a Chinese company's 50-year claim on the toll booths, cuts straight through the heart of a nation that America has quietly considered its own backyard for over 200 years. This is the story of how a Caribbean island most Americans could not find on a map became one of the most contested pieces of real estate in the 21st century's great power struggle. It's a story about highways and ports, yes, but it's also a story about debt, dependency, and the uncomfortable question every small nation on Earth is now being forced to answer. When 2 giants start fighting over your front yard, who do you let in the house? Let's start where every story like this has to start, with a map. Look at where Jamaica actually sits. It's not just an island in the sun with reggae music and white sand beaches, though it's certainly that too. It sits almost exactly in the middle of one of the busiest and most strategically vital waterways on the planet. To its north, the shipping lanes that connect the eastern United States to Europe. To its south, the approach corridors to the Panama Canal, the choke point that roughly 6% of all global trade squeezes through every single year. To its west, Central America. To its east, the open Atlantic and the trade routes to Africa and beyond. For over a century, the nation that controlled the waters around the Panama Canal effectively controlled a piece of the global economy's plumbing. The United States understood this so well that it built the canal itself, ran it for nearly 100 years, and has never stopped watching who operates near it. Jamaica isn't the canal, but it's close enough and positioned well enough that whoever holds serious influence there gets a front-row seat to everything moving through that corridor: a radar station, a surveillance post, a logistics hub, a place to refuel, resupply, or simply watch. And Jamaica isn't just sitting on good coordinates, it's built something to take advantage of them. The Kingston Freeport Terminal is one of the most modern deepwater ports in the entire Western Hemisphere, capable of handling the massive post-Panamax container ships that dominate global trade today. It's a transshipment hub, meaning cargo doesn't just start or end its journey there. It passes through, gets sorted, and heads back out to a dozen other destinations. Control the port, and in a very real sense, you get a hand on the dial of regional trade flow. The port's expansion over the last decade has been extensive, dredging the harbor deeper, extending the berths, adding new gantry cranes capable of servicing the largest vessels on the water. Global shipping and logistics companies with deep operational ties across Asia have been directly involved in modernizing and operating pieces of that terminal infrastructure, embedding foreign commercial interests into the daily rhythm of one of the busiest transshipment points in the entire Caribbean basin. Every container that moves through Kingston passes through system software and operational standards set, in part, by the companies that built and run them. That's not control in the dramatic movie plot sense of the word. It's something quieter and, in some ways, more permanent. Influence baked into the infrastructure itself, the kind that doesn't show up in a headline but shapes outcomes for decades. This is the chessboard, and for the last decade, 2 very different players have been moving pieces across it. To understand why an American president would fixate on a Caribbean island barely the size of Connecticut, you actually have to go back much further than Donald Trump. You have to go back to 1823 and a document called the Monroe Doctrine. President James Monroe declared, in essence, that the Western Hemisphere was closed for business to European colonial powers. The Americas, he said, were not up for further colonization or political interference from the Old World. For 2 centuries, in ways subtle and not so subtle, American presidents have treated that doctrine as gospel. The Caribbean and Latin America became what historians and diplomats have long, sometimes uncomfortably, called America's backyard, a region where Washington expected, and often enforced, a level of deference that it extended to almost no other part of the globe. That expectation didn't come from nowhere. The United States intervened militarily and economically across the region for generations, in Cuba, in the Dominican Republic, in Haiti, in Panama, in Grenada. During the Cold War, the entire logic of American Caribbean policy was built around a single fear, that a hostile foreign power might gain a foothold 90 miles from Florida, the way the Soviet Union did in Cuba in 1962, triggering the most dangerous nuclear standoff in human history. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't just a moment of terror. It became the founding trauma of American Caribbean strategy, the reason that, even decades later, any hint of a rival superpower building infrastructure, gathering intelligence, or expanding influence in the region sets off alarm bells in Washington that never fully went quiet. And it isn't just Cuba that shaped this instinct. Look just a few hundred miles from Jamaica to the tiny island of Grenada in 1983. A left-leaning government there had begun building a new international airport, with construction assistance from Cuba and financial backing partly tied to Soviet-aligned interests. Grenada's leaders insisted the airport was purely about tourism, a way to bring larger jets and larger numbers of visitors to an economy that desperately needed them. Washington saw something else entirely. A runway long enough to handle Soviet military transport aircraft sitting in the middle of the Caribbean, a potential forward base for a rival superpower, less than a 2-hour flight from the American coast. President Ronald Reagan ordered a full military invasion. American forces seized the island in a matter of days, citing the safety of American medical students there and the broader threat of a Soviet-Cuban foothold taking root so close to home. That invasion remains, to this day, one of the clearest examples in modern history of how seriously Washington takes the idea of rival infrastructure in the Caribbean. How a runway, a port, or a highway dismissed by its builders as simple economic development can be read by American strategists as something closer to a military prelude. Nobody in Washington today is suggesting Marines will storm a Jamaican bauxite refinery, but the historical memory of Grenada, the reflex that treats foreign-built infrastructure in the Caribbean as a potential strategic threat first and an economic project second, has never fully faded from how American policymakers view the region. It sits quietly underneath every conversation about Chinese highways, ports, and power plants in Jamaica today. So when Chinese money started flowing into Jamaica, not in secret, not through espionage, but through open, publicized, official state investment, it wasn't just an economic story to the people who think in these terms. It was read by a certain kind of American strategist as history rhyming. Another foreign power, another Caribbean island, another test of whether the old doctrine still holds. It's also worth understanding that the relationship between Jamaica and China is not a recent invention. Jamaica formally established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China back in 1972, becoming one of the first English-speaking Caribbean nations to do so. For decades, that relationship stayed relatively modest, a scattering of scholarships, cultural exchange programs, and small development grants, nothing close to the scale that would draw Washington's attention. It wasn't until China's Belt and Road Initiative launched in 2013, and Beijing began actively searching for infrastructure and resource opportunities across the developing world, that the Jamaica relationship transformed from a quiet diplomatic footnote into one of the most consequential economic partnerships on the island. In other words, this wasn't a sudden incursion. It was a slow-burning relationship that finally found its moment. And that moment happened to arrive at the exact same time American strategic anxiety about China was reaching a boiling point. Now bring Donald Trump into the picture. Trump's entire approach to foreign policy, from his first term through his second, has been built around a blunt, transactional worldview. America first. Allies exist to be leveraged, rivals exist to be confronted. And China, above every other nation on earth, has occupied the role of primary rival in Trump's foreign policy imagination. Not just as an economic competitor undercutting American manufacturing, but as a civilizational challenger seeking to remake the global order in its own image. Trump's advisors have gone so far as to frame current American policy in the region as a kind of update to the 200-year-old doctrine. Some have called it a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, an explicit declaration that Washington intends to reassert authority across the entire Western Hemisphere and push back against what it names directly as foreign interference from China, Russia, and Iran. This isn't background noise, it's stated strategy, and Jamaica sits close to the center of it. Here's where the story gets specific, where the abstract talk of superpowers and doctrines turns into asphalt, steel, and toll booths. In the mid-2010s, Jamaica needed a highway. The existing route between Kingston, the capital, and Ocho Rios, one of the island's premier tourist destinations, wound through steep, winding mountain roads that could take hours to navigate. A modern highway would cut that travel time dramatically, boost tourism revenue, and open new areas of the island to development. China Harbor Engineering Company, a subsidiary of a massive Chinese state-owned enterprise, built it. The project came in at roughly $730 million, and it delivered exactly what was promised: a fast modern highway connecting two of Jamaica's most important economic centers. On paper, it's a success story, infrastructure that a smaller, capital-constrained nation might never have been able to build on its own, delivered efficiently by a partner willing to put up the money. But here's the detail that turned an infrastructure story into a geopolitical one. As part of the financing arrangement, the Chinese company didn't just get paid for construction. It received a concession to collect toll revenue from that highway for 50 years. Half a century of steady income, guaranteed, from a piece of critical infrastructure running through the heart of a sovereign nation. To some economists, this is simply how large infrastructure financing works in the developing world, a public-private partnership, no different in structure from deals Western companies have struck in dozens of countries. But to critics, both inside Jamaica and in Washington, it's something else entirely. It's a foothold, a 50-year claim on a strategic transportation corridor held by a company ultimately accountable to the Chinese state. And it raises the exact question that debt-financed infrastructure deals raise everywhere they appear, from Sri Lanka to Kenya to Ecuador. What happens if a country can't keep up its end of the bargain? What happens when infrastructure debt becomes infrastructure leverage? This is the same fear that has followed China's Belt and Road Initiative around the globe. The sprawling trillion-dollar strategy Beijing launched in 2013 to fund ports, railways, highways, and power plants across dozens of developing nations, stitching them together into a network of trade routes and, critics argue, political obligations that all lead back to Beijing. Jamaica's North-South Highway is a small piece of an enormous global puzzle, but it's a piece sitting less than 500 miles from the American mainland, and the fear isn't hypothetical. There's a real-world precedent that gets cited constantly in these conversations, and it comes from an island on the other side of the planet, Sri Lanka. In the early 2010s, the Sri Lankan government borrowed heavily from Chinese state lenders to build the Hambantota port, a massive deepwater facility on the island's southern coast. The port struggled from the start. Traffic never materialized at the levels needed to service the debt, and Sri Lanka found itself unable to keep up with the loan payments. In 2017, facing a debt crisis it could not resolve, the Sri Lankan government handed over a 99-year lease on the port to a Chinese state-owned company in exchange for debt relief. 99 years. Effective control of a strategic deepwater port on a 99-year lease to a foreign state-owned company because a smaller nation couldn't keep pace with the debt it took on to build it in the first place. That single deal became the defining case study, some would say the cautionary tale for what critics call China's debt trap diplomacy. The pattern of financing large infrastructure projects in developing nations, then gaining long-term strategic control of that same infrastructure when repayment becomes unsustainable. China's government and its defenders reject that framing entirely, arguing that Sri Lanka's debt crisis stemmed from mismanagement on the Sri Lankan side and years of borrowing from multiple lenders, not a deliberate Chinese strategy to seize control. Independent economists remain genuinely divided on how much of the debt trap narrative reflects real Chinese strategy versus simple bad luck and poor planning by the borrowing nation. But regardless of where you land on that debate, the optics of Hambantota are impossible to unsee once you know them. And they're precisely why Jamaica's 50-year highway toll concession and its heavy reliance on Chinese capital for major infrastructure gets studied with such intensity by people trying to predict what happens next in Kingston. And the highway isn't even close to the most sensitive investment. Drive southwest from Kingston into the parish of St. Elizabeth and you'll find one of the richest bauxite deposits in the world. The raw ore that gets refined into alumina and then smelted into aluminum. Jamaica has an estimated 2 billion tons of bauxite reserves. For most of the 20th century, that resource was controlled by American and Canadian aluminum giants, Alcoa, Kaiser, Reynolds. It was for decades one of the clearest examples of American economic dominance in the Caribbean. In 2016, that changed. A Chinese state-owned company called Jiuquan Iron and Steel (JISCO), based in the northwestern Chinese province of Gansu, finalized a deal worth roughly $300 million to take over the massive Alpart alumina refinery, a plant that had sat closed since the 2009 financial crisis. JISCO didn't stop at reopening it. The company pledged to invest billions more. Reports at the time cited figures as high as $2 billion to modernize the refinery and build a new aluminum smelter, explicitly tied to Belt and Road ambitions. Officials from Gansu province later floated an even larger figure, up to $6 billion for a full industrial park and special economic zone around the site. It was described at the time as the largest single investment ever made in Jamaica and the first overseas investment ever made by that Chinese province. That refinery has faced real turbulence since. Production slowdowns, local environmental complaints from communities near the plant, and years of uncertain on-again, off-again modernization timelines. But even amid that turbulence, the strategic picture hasn't changed. As recently as 2025, Jamaican officials were still traveling to China for direct talks with JISCO's leadership, still negotiating the plant's future, still treating this relationship as central to the island's mining economy. Jamaica's bauxite and alumina exports were valued at over $600 million in 2025 alone, with investment in the sector climbing year over year. A resource that fuels aircraft, automobiles, and advanced manufacturing, sitting substantially in Chinese hands on an island in America's own hemisphere. And bauxite and highways aren't the whole picture either. Chinese state-linked firms have financed and built solar and hydropower projects across the island, helping Jamaica chip away at an electricity grid that, for decades, relied heavily on expensive imported oil. Chinese contractors have built hospitals, sporting facilities, and government buildings, often financed through concessional loans that come with far fewer conditions attached than the kind of lending Jamaica would typically get from Western institutions like the International Monetary Fund. Chinese developers have also shown growing interest in Jamaican real estate and tourism infrastructure. Hotels, resort properties, commercial developments. The same sectors that form the backbone of the island's economy and its relationship with American visitors. Each of these deals, taken on its own, looks like ordinary economic development. Taken together, they form a footprint that touches nearly every sector of Jamaican public life. Energy, healthcare, transportation, trade, and tourism, all with a Chinese state-linked hand somewhere in the picture. Add it up, and you get a pattern that's hard to ignore. A highway with a 50-year toll concession. A modernized free port plugged into a global trade initiative headquartered in Beijing. A controlling stake in one of the richest bauxite deposits on the planet. Renewable energy projects. Real estate. None of it happened in secret. All of it was public, negotiated, signed, and celebrated by Jamaican officials looking for capital that wasn't coming fast enough from anywhere else. And that last point matters more than almost anything else in this story, because it explains why Jamaica said yes. Before we go further, if this kind of story, the quiet, high-stakes maneuvering that shapes the world most people never hear about, is the kind of thing you want more of, this is exactly the channel for that. We're working to reach 10,000 subscribers, and every single one of you who hits that subscribe button helps make that happen, and tells us there's an audience hungry for stories told with depth, not headlines. So if you haven't yet, take a second, subscribe, and stay with us, because this story is about to get a lot more complicated. Here's the number that explains almost everything. By various estimates, China has poured somewhere in the range of $2 billion into Jamaican infrastructure, ports, and energy projects over the past decade and a half. In the same period, American development aid and trade-related assistance to Jamaica has totaled a fraction of that, commonly cited around $600 million. spread across security programs, education initiatives, and governance support through mechanisms like the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative and USAT funding. That gap is not small. It's not a rounding error. It's the difference between a nation that shows up with concrete, steel, and container cranes and a nation that shows up with training programs and policy workshops. Both have value. Highways don't build themselves, and neither does a functioning Coast Guard. But if you are the elected leader of a developing island nation and one partner offers to modernize your ports and pave your roads while another partner offers seminars on governance best practices, the political calculus writes itself. Roads get you re-elected. Position papers do not. This is the trap at the center of the entire U.S.-China-Caribbean rivalry, and it's not unique to Jamaica. It's playing out from the Bahamas to Trinidad and Tobago to the Dominican Republic, where a diplomatic switch away from recognizing Taiwan and toward recognizing Beijing was followed almost immediately by a surge in Chinese economic engagement. 22 countries across Latin America and the Caribbean have now signed onto China's Belt and Road framework. The United States built its regional dominance over 2 centuries through military power, cultural influence, and economic gravity. China is attempting something different, buying its way into relevance one port, one highway, one power plant at a time. And in nation after nation, it's working because China is simply willing to spend more faster with fewer conditions attached than Washington has been in decades. So when Donald Trump talks about China setting up everywhere and vows not to let it happen in America's own backyard, he's not describing a hypothetical. He's describing a trend line that's been building for 15 years, and Jamaica has become one of its clearest and most visible test cases. This isn't abstract rhetoric from Trump either. It's shown up in concrete diplomatic moves. Take his administration's approach to Panama in early 2025. When Secretary of State Marco Rubio traveled there, specifically to confront concerns over Chinese-linked control of ports near the Panama Canal, warning, in direct terms, that Chinese corporate influence over canal infrastructure could threaten the neutrality guaranteed under the treaty that handed the canal back to Panama in the first place. That trip wasn't really about Panama alone. It was a signal, sent to every government in the region, about where Washington's red lines now sit. Jamaica has received that same kind of attention. When Trump nominated a new ambassador to Jamaica, the confirmation hearing made the administration's priorities unmistakably clear. Among the stated goals, strengthening security cooperation, cracking down on transnational crime and lottery scams targeting American citizens, and explicitly pushing back against China's growing footprint on the island. It's worth pausing on that. An ambassadorial confirmation hearing, the kind of proceeding that rarely makes headlines, treated countering Chinese influence in Jamaica as one of the 4 central pillars of the entire diplomatic mission. That's not incidental. That's strategy, stated out loud on the record for anyone paying attention. The lottery scam piece deserves its own moment because it's a reminder that not every strand of this relationship is about superpower rivalry. Some of it is simply about protecting ordinary people. For years, organized scam operations based in Jamaica have targeted elderly Americans specifically, calling to falsely inform them they've won a major lottery prize, then pressuring them to wire thousands of dollars in supposed fees and taxes to claim winnings that never existed. It's a devastating scheme that has cost American victims, many of them retirees, staggering sums of money and, in some documented cases, their life savings. Combating that network sits alongside the China question as one of the new ambassador's stated top priorities, a reminder that even in a relationship this geopolitically loaded, some of the most urgent concerns are simply about keeping ordinary citizens safe from criminal exploitation, regardless of which superpower is watching. And the stakes Washington points to are not purely symbolic. Bilateral trade between the U.S. and Jamaica exceeded $3 billion in 2025. More than 70% of visitors to the island are American. Tens of thousands of Jamaicans work seasonally in the United States. Thousands of American citizens live in Jamaica full-time and roughly 2 million more visit every single year. This is not a distant, disconnected relationship. It's dense, personal, and economically intertwined in ways that make Washington deeply uncomfortable watching a rival superpower expand its footprint in the same space. Some analysts argue Washington is overreacting, that Jamaica and its Caribbean neighbors simply don't have the advanced technology sectors or military infrastructure that would make them meaningful. platforms for genuine espionage or strategic threat, and that treating every port deal as a national security crisis risks alienating exactly the partners America needs to keep close. Critics of the current approach point out that decades of inconsistent American attention toward the Caribbean, aid that surges during a crisis and quietly dries up once headlines move on, did far more to open the door for Chinese investment than anything Beijing did on its own. If Washington had shown up with competitive capital 15 years ago, they argue, this entire conversation about Chinese influence might never have needed to happen at all. Some go further, suggesting that framing every Chinese infrastructure deal through a purely adversarial lens risks pushing Caribbean nations toward Beijing rather than away from it, by signaling that Washington sees the relationship as a chessboard rather than a partnership. It's a fair point and one worth sitting with. Not every Chinese-financed highway is a Trojan horse. Sometimes a road is just a road, built because a government needed capital and China was the fastest, least conditional source willing to provide it. But the counter-argument is just as real. Strategic value isn't only measured in missile silos and fighter jets. It's measured in who controls the switches, the ports, the power grids, the data cables, the toll roads, because those are the levers that matter in a crisis or a negotiation, or a quiet contest for influence that never makes the news until it's already been decided. A nation doesn't need advanced weapons technology to matter strategically. It only needs to sit in the right place, at the right time, with infrastructure controlled by the wrong rival, for a great power thousands of miles away to suddenly take a very close interest in what's happening on the ground. This is precisely why the term ground zero has started appearing in serious foreign policy commentary about Jamaica's position in this rivalry, not because anyone expects tank in Kingston, but because piece by piece, deal by deal, Jamaica has become one of the clearest live demonstrations of what happens when American strategic anxiety collides directly with Chinese economic ambition, and the island itself gets caught in the middle, trying to extract maximum benefit from both without becoming a casualty of either. Widen the lens for a moment, because Jamaica is not fighting this battle alone, even if it sometimes feels that way from Kingston. Across the wider Caribbean and Central America, the same story is repeating with different local details. In the Bahamas, Chinese-linked involvement in major port projects near Freeport has put Beijing's infrastructure influence within close range of vital American sea lanes. Control over logistics and modernization decisions that matter every bit as much as formal ownership on paper. In Trinidad and Tobago, Chinese participation in energy and industrial projects has embedded influence in a nation whose oil and gas output plugs directly into Atlantic energy markets that Western economies depend on. In the Dominican Republic, the political switch from recognizing Taiwan to recognizing Beijing came first, and the accelerated economic engagement followed right behind it. A pattern strategists now watch closely as a leading indicator of where Chinese investment will land next. Put these pieces on a single map and a picture emerges that goes well beyond any one country's individual choices. It looks to American strategists like a slow, methodical island-by-island adaptation of Chinese economic gravity across an entire hemisphere that Washington has, for 2 centuries, treated as non-negotiable territory. Whether that's a fair characterization of China's intentions or an overcorrection born of Cold War-era anxiety is a genuinely open question, one that serious people on both sides of the debate continue to argue about. But the pattern itself, the money, the ports, the highways, the toll concessions, is not in dispute. It's documented, public, and growing. So where does that leave Jamaica itself, the actual country, not the chessboard square? Jamaica's government has for years walked an extraordinarily careful line. Its leaders have said repeatedly and publicly that the island welcomes partnership with any nation willing to align with its own vision for sustainable development. Language that's diplomatic almost to the point of being deliberately non-committal, and that's exactly the point. Jamaica isn't trying to pick a side in a great power struggle it never asked to be part of. It's trying to extract maximum value from both superpowers simultaneously, without becoming so dependent on either one that it loses control of its own decisions. That balancing act sits at the core of Jamaica's own long-term development strategy, often referred to as Vision 2030. An ambitious plan to transform the island's economy, infrastructure, and global standing by the end of this decade. Chinese capital has helped fund pieces of that vision that Jamaica's own government budget simply could not have covered alone. At the very same time, Jamaican officials continue deepening security cooperation, trade ties, and diplomatic engagement with Washington, aware that the American relationship, built on geographic proximity, tourism dependency, and generations of migration and cultural exchange, isn't something that can simply be replaced by a new partner with a bigger checkbook. It's a genuinely difficult position to be in. Say yes to too much Chinese investment and risk the kind of debt entanglement that has strained sovereignty in other nations around the world, from Sri Lanka's ports to parts of East Africa. Say no and lose access to capital that funds real roads, real jobs, and real modernization that improves the day-to-day lives of Jamaican citizens right now. Not in some hypothetical future where Western aid finally scales up to match it. There is no clean, obviously correct answer here. There is only a series of trade-offs made under pressure by a small nation trying to navigate between two superpowers that each, in their own way, want something from the relationship. Jamaica has actually navigated something like this before, and its own recent economic history offers a clue about why officials are so wary of overdependence on any single lender, foreign or otherwise. In the 2010s, Jamaica went through a punishing period of debt restructuring and fiscal discipline under agreements with the International Monetary Fund, clawing its way down from one of the highest debt-to-GDP ratios in the world to a far more sustainable position through years of painful austerity. That experience left a deep institutional memory inside the Jamaican government about the dangers of debt dependency. No matter which country or institution is on the other side of the loan agreement, it's part of why Jamaican officials, even while accepting billions in Chinese capital, have continued to describe their approach publicly in careful, guarded language. Partnership on Jamaica's own terms, investment that serves Jamaica's own development goals, not entanglement that compromises decisions made in Kingston. Whether that careful language translates into equally careful practice over the long run is exactly what analysts on both sides of the Atlantic are watching most closely. And this is where the human stakes of this story actually live, not in the abstract language of spheres of influence and strategic corridors, but in the everyday reality of a nation of under 3 million people whose economic future is being shaped, in no small part, by decisions made in boardrooms in Beijing and briefing rooms in Washington. The highway workers who built the north-south route, the families in St. Elizabeth living near the Alpart refinery, some of whom have raised real concerns about environmental impact and air quality tied to its operations, describing crop damage and health worries linked to emissions from the plant. The dockworkers at Kingston Freeport, the tourism industry that depends overwhelmingly on American visitors, even as Chinese capital modernizes the very roads those visitors drive on. Every one of these people has a stake in a rivalry they had almost no hand in creating. Consider what that actually feels like on the ground. A farmer in St. Elizabeth Parish doesn't wake up thinking about the Monroe Doctrine or Belt and Road summits. He wakes up thinking about whether the air quality near his fields is getting worse, whether the refinery down the road is hiring this season, and whether the government negotiating with Beijing on his behalf is getting a fair deal or a costly one. A hotel worker in Ocho Rios doesn't think in terms of great power competition. She thinks about whether American tourists are still coming, whether the new highway cut her commute in half, and whether her job is secure regardless of which flag is stitched into the investment paperwork upstream. This is the texture that gets lost in strategic briefings and cable news segments. The reality that geopolitics at ground level is measured in paychecks, air quality, and commute times, not an abstract talk of spheres of influence. So where does this go from here? That's the honest question, and nobody, not in Washington, not in Beijing, not in Kingston, has a fully settled answer. If current trends continue, expect the pressure to intensify rather than ease. Washington has made unmistakably clear, through ambassadorial appointments, through formal national security strategy documents invoking an updated Monroe Doctrine, through direct diplomatic confrontations over Chinese port influence from Panama outward across the region, that it intends to treat Chinese infrastructure investment in the Western Hemisphere as a strategic priority, not a background economic story. That likely means more American aid packages aimed specifically at competing with Chinese capital. It likely means more security cooperation, more diplomatic visits, more explicit public statements naming China as a rival to be countered rather than simply a competitor to be outnegotiated. On the other side, China shows no signs of pulling back. Beijing's most recent policy papers on Latin America and the Caribbean are longer, more detailed, and more ambitious than anything it has published on the region before, explicitly positioning China as an alternative partner for nations frustrated with what Chinese officials characterize as American hegemony and inconsistent commitment. China regularly gathers regional leaders through a summit process with the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, using those meetings to unveil new roadmaps for expanded trade, investment, and technology cooperation across the hemisphere. These aren't quiet, low-profile gatherings. They're major diplomatic events attended by heads of state that China uses deliberately to showcase itself as a patient, long-term partner in direct contrast to what Beijing portrays as an inconsistent and transactional United States. Whether or not you find that framing persuasive, it reveals a strategy built for the long game, not a quick in-and-out investment cycle. China is not treating its Caribbean relationships as temporary. Caught between these two long-term strategies is a small island nation that simply wants modern roads, a stable economy, and the freedom to make its own choices without either superpower dictating the terms. Whether Jamaica manages to hold that position, extracting genuine benefit from both Washington and Beijing, without becoming dependent on either, may end up being one of the most instructive case studies of this entire era of great power competition. Not because Jamaica is uniquely powerful, but because it's uniquely exposed, sitting directly in the path of two giants who have both decided this stretch of Caribbean water matters far more than its size on a map would ever suggest. Picture for a moment how this could actually unfold over the next few years, because the possibilities aren't identical and the differences matter. In one version of this story, Washington gets serious, not just with rhetoric, but with real capital. American and allied investment funds pour into Caribbean infrastructure at a scale that finally rivals what Beijing has offered, competing project for project, port for port. Jamaica ends up in the enviable position of having genuine leverage, two superpowers actively bidding for its favor, and the ability to negotiate better terms from both. That's the optimistic version, and there are people in Washington who genuinely believe it's achievable if the political will exists to fund it. In a second version, American attention proves cyclical, the way it often has in the past. Intense for a news cycle, then quietly deprioritized once the next crisis captures Washington's focus. Chinese capital, patient and consistent by design, continues flowing in without serious competition, and Jamaica's economic dependency on Beijing deepens year over year, not through any single dramatic moment, but through the slow accumulation of debt, contracts, and infrastructure that becomes harder to walk away from with each passing year. That's the version that worries the analysts who study debt trap dynamics most closely. And in a third, more volatile version, the rivalry itself becomes the story. Washington applies real diplomatic and economic pressure on Jamaica to limit or unwind its Chinese partnerships, the way it has pushed allies elsewhere in the world to reconsider Chinese telecom and infrastructure deals. Jamaica gets forced into an uncomfortable choice it spent a decade trying to avoid, and the island's careful balancing act collapses under pressure from a superpower that decided patience was no longer an option. Nobody currently expects this scenario to play out in dramatic fashion, but quieter versions of it, a cancelled contract here, a diplomatic ultimatum there, are already visible if you know where to look. Which of these three futures actually happens likely depends less on anything Jamaica does, and more on decisions being made right now in Washington and Beijing, in rooms neither the Jamaican government nor the Jamaican public will ever see. That, more than anything else, is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire story. A nation of under 3 million people, with a rich culture and a proud history of independence, watching its economic future get shaped in large part by the strategic calculations of two governments an ocean apart. So here's the real question, the one worth sitting with after everything you've just heard. Should a small nation like Jamaica be forced to choose a side in a rivalry this size at all? Or is there a genuine path, a realistic one, not just a diplomatic talking point, where an island this size plays two superpowers against each other and comes out ahead on both sides of the table? Is Jamaica showing every small nation on Earth how to survive the next era of great power competition? Or is it a cautionary tale still waiting to fully play out? Tell us what you think in the comments. Not just yes or no, tell us which risk worries you more, the risk of debt dependency on Chinese capital or the risk of strategic overreach from a United States determined to reassert control over its own backyard. That's a real question, without an easy answer. And some of the most interesting perspectives on stories like this one come directly from the people watching and reading about them in real time, not from the headlines themselves. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that sit underneath the headlines where the real decisions about power, money, and influence are actually being made, subscribe to this channel and join us as we push toward 10,000 subscribers together. Every subscription helps us keep telling these stories with the depth and context they deserve. Instead of the 30-second version, you'd get scrolling past a headline. Because the truth is, the biggest geopolitical stories of the next decade may not be decided in Washington or Beijing at all. They may be decided in small nations like Jamaica, hills like St. Elizabeth, and ports like Kingston, places most of the world never thinks to look until the day the world realizes it should have been watching all along. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.